Hello, everyone. We're just going to wait a minute or two as attendees start to trickle into the virtual information session. And we'll get started in about a minute. Wonderful. So I see quite a few attendees have trickled in. So we'll go ahead and get started because we do have an hour here. So hi, everyone. My name is Shara Singh, and I'm the manager of corporate communications at the board. Thank you tonight for joining us for the long-term accommodation and program plan virtual information session. Tonight, you'll hear more about the LTAPP process, review the plan's themes, goals, and recommendations, and you'll get the opportunity to ask questions. Before we begin, I'm going to pass it over to Jonathan Howley, Senior Manager of Planning and Accountability, to lead us in prayer and to recite the land acknowledgement.
Thank you, Shara. So let us begin with a prayer, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Dear Heavenly Father, as we gather here today, we humbly bow before your presence. Grant us the wisdom to discern, the humility to accept, and the strength to follow the path you've set before us. We seek your guidance, Lord, as we embark on this meeting. May your light shine upon our discussions, and may our decisions align with your divine will. In your holy name we pray. Amen. Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And now we're going to do the land acknowledgement. The land we walk on belongs to the Creator. Earth does not belong to humanity, but rather humanity is part of the earth. The land was created to be enjoyed by all living beings, a principle reflected in the dish with one spoon covenant, taking only what we need to preserve our earth for generations, leaving some for others as a sign of our respect and caring, and keeping it clean by revitalizing the land to sustain generations to come. All Toronto Catholic District School Board properties are situated on the traditional territories of the Anishinaabeg, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Wendat peoples. We recognize that the land covered by Treaty 13 is held by the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. We also listen to the echoes of their prayers to the Creator and respect the beauty of Mother Earth while striving to learn and draw wisdom from the First Nations, Inuit, and Métis traditions. And now I'm going to pass it to Michael Liberto, Superintendent of Planning, to do a bit of an intro. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Jonathan. As Jonathan said, I'm Michael Liberto. I'm the Board Superintendent of Planning and Development. I want to thank everyone for joining tonight's information session on the board's proposed long-term accommodation and program plan. So tonight's session is the start of a series of engagement opportunities taking place over the next month. And we're sharing the proposed plan to assist the board in gathering valuable feedback as we move forward. So the presentation is going to show a new approach to addressing the board's accommodation and programming needs, and kind of provides a high-level overview of a long-term strategy. So the LTAPP process itself is fairly fluid, as there are a lot of factors to consider as the board continues to move forward in the process. It's also important to note that some of the concepts that are being presented tonight are still exploratory in nature and continue to be developed. We encourage you to share your thoughts and ask questions, especially as we approach the end of the session. And I'll now pass it over to the consulting team to introduce themselves and start tonight's presentation.
Just before we go to the consultants, I wanted to add that we did receive a few questions in advance of tonight's session, and we will try our best to get through as many relevant questions as possible at the end. If you didn't submit a question in advance and you'd like to submit a question during the session, you can use the Q&A tool in Zoom to submit a question or comment, and we'll be monitoring those. And relevant questions that we are unable to get to tonight will be answered online on our community engagement site, which is engage.tcdsb.org. And the information session is also being recorded so that you can watch it back again if you have any questions or if you may have missed anything during the session. And then I just want to note that I'd also like to introduce a few of the staff members who are joining us today. Today joining us, we have Michael Liberto, who's the Superintendent of Planning and Development Services. We have Adrian Delamora, Associate Director of Academic Affairs and the Chief Operating Officer. We also have Barbara Leparati, Head of Planning Services, Erica Pilata, Head of Development Services, and again, Jonathan Howley, Senior Manager, Planning and Accountability. And then we're joined by our consultants who will present right after, Cynthia Clark from Quadrant Advisory Group and Molly Doan from Blueprint. Thank you. So I'll kick it over to the consultants to present.
Good evening. My name is Cynthia Clark, and I'm president of Quadrant Advisory. I've been assisting more than 50 of the 72 school boards in Ontario for the last 38 years on school board planning matters. Do you want to go on to the next slide there, Jonathan, please? What we wanted to cover with you this evening is, first of all, to provide to you some background information. You want to go to the agenda there? Thank you very much. Background information on what is a long-term accommodation and program plan. What are the objectives within the LTAPP is the short acronym for that. And talk a little bit about the changing landscape in the city of Toronto and enrollment and funding challenges for the board, as well as accommodation challenges. And as Michael referred to, we're going to talk a little bit about a proposed innovative approach to capital asset management and program enhancements that we're floating to the board on an exploratory nature. And then also talk a little bit more about the strategies in the LTAPP and the program review, and much of that's going to be covered by Molly Doan. And then certainly the advantages of optimizing enrollment to capacity and future enrollment trends and why that's important to the LTAPP exercise. And then the financial implications of the LTAPP strategy. And then we're going to come back to Molly, and she's going to talk about the extensive work that her firm has undertaken on program review. And then we're going to give you a little more information, as Michael mentioned, about the additional engagement opportunities and next steps involved in the LTAPP stakeholder consultation process, and then Q&A. So a long-term accommodation and program plan. First, let me just apologize. I have a cold, and so we'll see if I can keep my voice in good check here. Long-term accommodation and program plan is a planning tool that all school boards in Ontario use to guide student accommodation planning and program delivery and over a 15-year period. The Ministry of Education requires school boards to prepare enrollment projections over a 15-year period. They're used for accommodation planning, education development charges, and a whole host of planning matters that school boards work with the ministry on. Normally, school boards will update their LTAPP every 5 years so that they can account for any changes in the legislation or funding policies, any demographic and enrollment trends, board policies and decisions that are taken by the board. And normally, school boards will, once they've completed a draft LTAPP, they will share those findings with a variety of stakeholders and the Ministry of Education in consultation. Some of the types of decisions and actions that are considered as part of the development of an LTAPP are school boundary reviews. So looking at expanding or contracting school boundaries, particularly when there is enrollment growth in particular areas. Another particular action a board might take is to look at an accommodation and program review, making an adjustment to location or delivery of programs, typically because of program pressure. So if, for example, there might be more students in a French immersion program in a school than is balanced for the system. And so they might look at a different adjustment to how that program's delivered in that area. One of the things that the board can also look at is acquiring land or an interest in land in order to build new schools in underserved areas. And this board adopted an education development charges bylaw in December 2023 as a means of financing the acquisition of some of that land and having the ability to build new schools in underserved areas. And we'll talk about where those might be. And then, of course, renewing school buildings and life cycle replacement as part of the program plan, and also looking at where the board needs to build new schools or additions because of projected increases in enrollment in those particular communities. We also wanted to make sure we considered in the LTAP identifying potential partnership opportunities. These could be with the City of Toronto, they could be with coterminous school boards, but opportunities in partnership that would improve learning spaces and programs for students. The LTAP looks to identify future capital projects and the potential funding sources to pay for those capital projects. And it looks at making sure that whatever is proposed in the LTAP over that 15-year period, that the financial impact of those decisions take into consideration both capital and operating budgets. And operating budgets in the term of the LTAP includes staffing costs. The final thing that we looked at in the long-term plan was evaluating the potential for capital projects that would be designed to balance enrollment to capacity over that 15-year forecast period. So some of the objectives in the long-term plan is to make sure that we consider the establishment and sustain a sufficient distribution of Toronto Catholic schools across the city to ensure access for all students and to try and improve access for students where that's possible in the LTAP. To develop a dynamic and adaptable strategy that responds to evolving circumstances, ministry initiatives, changes in legislation, and capitalizes on emerging opportunities. And oftentimes those emerging opportunities can come from certain investment policies that the province is putting together and would like school boards to invest in, or it can be things like investing in properties within the City of Toronto that allows the board to manage its portfolio better as it goes forward. And then, of course, engage the community and stakeholders in this planning process and to gather input on accommodation and program decisions. More importantly for students is to make sure that there's a fair and equitable distribution of educational programs across the system, and to ensure that the schools are equipped to meet the needs of this student population for the board over time. One of the key objectives is to make sure that the accommodation and the program decisions that will be made by the trustees over the next 15 years are financially sustainable. And they also enhance opportunities for the board to make capital investments and to be able to provide enhanced program appropriate learning spaces where feasible. The LTAP guiding principles need to align with the board's multi-year strategic plan and reflect best practices that are observed across the GTA school boards. The LTAP recommendations support a distribution of Catholic schools across the City of Toronto to meet accommodation needs and a fair allocation of programs throughout the system that strategically emphasize community engagement and consultation always with the board, program excellence and opportunities for students, partnerships and community engagement, and equity, access, and safety for students. This map is prepared by the City of Toronto. It is the way in which they can spatially demonstrate development activity across the City of Toronto. So homes that are being proposed to be built that are in what they call the development pipeline in the City of Toronto, it really just is to give you an idea of where major residential development is expected to happen. It's along the major arterial corridors like the Yonge Street corridor, major transit-oriented centers, and then you'll see most particularly that a significant amount of the development is proposed for the downtown core. Some of the demographic changes, though, that are taking place in the City of Toronto are important to observe. The Catholic school-age population has continued to decline. If you look at the census back in 1991, 35% of the people living in the City of Toronto recognize themselves as Catholic supporters. And that number is only just over 24% as of 2021 census. Most of the development going forward, a very significant portion of it is high-rise development. So in other words, vertical development, fewer single-family homes being built and many more high-rise condos. The difference is because of the size of these units, they contribute minimally to student enrollment for the Toronto Catholic District School Board. And then finally, to point out that that major residential development that is in the downtown, in that area that's very heavily concentrated at the foot of Yonge Street, is an area that currently lacks sufficient schools for the Toronto Catholic District School Board. The Ministry of Finance prepares population projections on behalf of the province, and they've recently updated those. And I thought it was important to be able to say to you that if you look at the updates that they've done and you look going out 15 years, which is our forecast time period here, back in 2021, they were projecting an 18% increase in elementary school children. That's 4 to 13-year-old children. They've dropped that down to just under 4% now. A part of that is because the federal government has reduced the immigration targets. And then, as you're all aware, housing affordability is impacting the retention of families within the city of Toronto. Jonathan, yep, thanks. Some of the financial challenges that the school board faces. They're the only capital-related funding sources that are available to all Ontario school boards under the current funding model are school renewal funds and condition assessment funds. The Ministry of Education has recently put a time limit on how long the board can take to spend the renewal funds. It's a 2-year time frame, and as board staff will tell you, that's very difficult to accomplish in the city of Toronto. There's a lot of planning approvals that are required in order to be able to retrofit or do major renewal on schools. And renewal funds are really in order to take the elements of a building, like the heating systems, the plumbing systems, the mechanical systems, even carpentry in the classrooms, and renew those particular components of the building as required over time. The board also, of course, gets operating funds. All boards do in Ontario. This is primarily based on a per pupil formula. Therefore, the operating budgets and the ability to balance operating budgets is adversely affected when there is underutilization of schools. Education development charges, as I said, is definitely a primary source of funding for the Toronto Catholic District School Board. However, the legislation caps the amount of revenue that the board can take in from education development charges, and the board must continue to be eligible to continue to adopt a bylaw. So those are just some of the impediments to continuing to use that funding source. So right at the moment, the system is when the Minister of Education issues a memorandum asking for all school boards to submit capital priority projects, in other words, projects they wish to have funded, you're competing against all 72 school boards, hoping that your particular projects that are submitted are chosen for funding. It often means, though, that the government is looking for particular types of projects to support their own investment policies. In other words, they might be looking for new school projects that support enrollment growth in a particular year as their provincial policy investments. The key thing is that there is no particular funding source to allow a school board to invest in new or expanded program enhancements for students. And so that's a challenge. From an accommodation perspective, some of the challenges are, and this is not just Toronto Catholic, but all across Ontario, most of the schools that are in Ontario were built 50, 60 years ago to serve the baby boom population. And they were designed to serve a very different layout of Catholic supported communities than is evident today. So there's been shifting of Catholic supported communities, and some of those schools are larger than they need to be in particular areas, or they're not in the proper area where Catholic students are residing today. So not all schools are the right size or in the right locations to serve current and future Toronto Catholic students. And then, as we said, those funding limitations we talked about on the previous slide impact the board's ability to have all of the funding it needs when it wants to build and needs to build new schools or additions, or undertake major retrofits to schools, or wants to upgrade the schools with advanced learning spaces, like add some more technology supported or labs or specialized learning spaces, or to acquire land for areas that are underserved. So some of those areas that were on the map that the City of Toronto prepares that I was talking to, the board needs schools in those particular areas, and we need to build schools to have a presence there. Expanding specialty programs. I think everyone would want to have the ability to expand specialty programs for students all across the board, but the funding limitations certainly impact the board's ability to do that wholesale. And then some of the other elements that were presented to us when we were consulting with the trustees about this time last year was the ability for the board to make sure that there is childcare, before and after school programs, and community services at its schools. So the long-term plan looks to explore alternative funding opportunities. Certainly the board could continue on the basis of waiting for the government to invite them to submit a capital priority request in hopes that they would receive funding. But what has changed more recently is that post the pandemic, the land prices and the land values in the city of Toronto have increased substantially. The province of Ontario has pushed for more housing to be built more quickly. And for that reason, municipalities like the city of Toronto are allowing more density on properties as part of fulfilling that housing pledge. And so what that means is that land and the land air rights, so if we could call that the air rights above the buildings today. So let's say that the Toronto Catholic Board had a building in downtown Toronto that was 4 stories in an area where the city was approving 40 or 50-story high rises to be built. There is an opportunity for the board to actually generate funding, and it's what we call a self-funding opportunity. This is very exploratory, question mark behind it, but enabling the board to self-fund, we believe, at least $2 billion in improvements and reduce its reliance on waiting for capital priority approvals, which come from taxpayer grants. And maximizing the asset value of the board's portfolio, focusing on redeveloping lands that are not maximizing or optimizing its use in partnership with developers. Examining ways to potentially boost Toronto Catholic enrollment, and then ensuring that the facility capacity and the operating costs are better aligned with student enrollments going forward. Property investment wise, reviewing the rationale for continued investment in properties with limited utilization. Does that make sense to do? Reviewing opportunities for the redevelopment of ward facilities that would generate capital investment funds. The example I just gave you of a 4-story building in an area that is accommodating something of higher density. Improving facility utilization in schools to mitigate future deficits, particularly in operating deficits. Addressing backlog costs through rebuilding schools and using holding facilities to accommodate rebuilds. That's something that's necessary. And then from a program perspective, which is all important here, investing in tech-supported learning, equitable and improved access to specialized programs for all Toronto Catholic students. So some of the strategies that are employed in the draft LTAPP, we have recognized the new schools need to be built in underserved areas that consistent with the board's EDC bylaw. We have recognized that some schools could be rebuilt and right-sized to align with their projected enrollment, that there is an opportunity to invest in school renewal and major retrofits of some schools to bring their condition up to the standards of today, and then optimizing in accordance with the ministry's policy for dispositions, assessing potential partnership opportunities to optimize properties in the board's portfolio. And in some cases, the board has some properties that could be severed and sold as part of larger properties that the board has in its portfolio today. And then conducting boundary reviews to make sure that you can enhance facility utilization. So you might have a school in one area that's oversubscribed and another one fairly close by that's undersubscribed. So boundary reviews and utilization reviews often look at that particular situation. So collaborating with the city, because we notice in a number of cases, the board might have smaller play fields and yet be adjacent to city-owned park amenities, and whether or not you could enter into agreements to invest in those park amenities, but secure exclusive use agreements for the students during school hours. working sometimes with nearby school boards for joint elementary schools with shared playfields, similar to the Railway Lands development, Bishop Macdonnell, that was entered into as a joint use. Partnering with major sports facilities for secondary programs with athletic programs. This was something that was raised quite often by trustees and superintendents about athletic programs at the secondary level. It's very expensive for a board to have the types of elite sports facilities that one might want to have for elite athletic programs. So we looked instead at the question of the location of schools adjacent to major sports facilities owned by the municipality or others, and whether that could be part of a partnership. In a number of cases, the amount of development that's going forward will be very intensified. In other words, as much as 80 stories and very intensified land use. In those particular cases, it may make more sense to develop smaller, sustainably enrolled schools in those particular areas. And also we were asked to look at beyond just the schools, but also look at the alternative learning facilities the board has in its portfolio and its administration spaces, but looking at establishing strategically located alternative learning and administration. One of the other aspects of the LTAPP was to explore the development of congregated learning centers for enhanced education access for all students at the elementary and secondary level. And then, of course, establishing a facility for maintenance and construction. The board does have in-house staff that provide some of those functions to maintain and provide construction services at schools, but expanding on that and including that as part of a focused secondary school focused on machine learning. So optimizing enrollment to capacity, why is that important? It is what, from a financial perspective, allows the board to maximize its investment in substantive improvements to school facilities and to ensure that they have the right size and the right location of schools to serve future enrollment. It matches the operating expenditures, which, as I said, include teaching and staffing, to the enrollment needs. And it makes sure that it provides all senior elementary and secondary school students with enhanced learning opportunities. And it allows the board to have the funds to invest in providing schools in underserved areas where the board currently doesn't have schools. Some of the financial implications of the LTAPP is in working with the business services section of the board. What was recognized is it is expected that the board will have an operating deficit of just over 10% for this particular school year. The board's ability to balance its expenditures with annual grant funding is primarily tied to student enrollments. So if you have, the same number of students as you have capacity in the schools, then that maximizes your ability to spread the operating costs across the system. One of the things that we kept in mind when we were developing the draft LTAPP was what impact would it have on operating savings? And we can say that in the draft at the moment, it would lead to a 10% reduction in operating costs over the 15 years, potentially eliminating that funding shortfall based on the current legislative structure. That's not to say that the legislation wouldn't change over the next 15 years, but it would provide the flexibility for the board to invest in additional subject matter teaching resources. Facility renewal. So this is an industry standard. Industry standard is what they call FCI, which you'll see on this slide here, and it stands for Facility Condition Index. If I put it in the context of your home, you would say your home's value is X. The things that need to be replaced or upgraded in your home due to age are Y. And so if you take the Y divided over the X, it gives you what they call an FCI and an index. So when you're looking at schools, you're looking at schools where the cost to repair or replace older components within the school relative to the cost to replace the school start to exceed 40%. That's something we pay particular attention to. Right at the moment, the Toronto Catholic Board faces an $840 million facility backlog. This is likely undervalued, the $840 million, because there have been limited assessments of school buildings in Ontario undertaken since 2016, in part because of the pandemic. And what we do know is that there's been an exponential increase in labor and material costs since 2019. And so that's not factored into the $840 million. One of the things that the LTAPP looks to identify is, can we invest in rebuilding some schools or doing major retrofits in order to reduce that deferred facility burden for the board? And yes, the LTAPP, as is currently drafted, estimates a reduction of more than 20% in the identified facility renewal needs. The other thing that it does is it looks at trying to improve the age of the facilities, schools in the portfolio. As I mentioned earlier, a lot of the schools were built in the 1950s and 60s. So right at the moment, only 13% of the schools in the portfolio were built post 2000. In the strategy, we would see that increase to 32%. So I'm going to hand this over to Molly and talk about program review. Go for it. There you go.
Thank you, Cynthia. And thank you everyone for joining us this evening. It's nice to see such a big group of folks on the call tonight. So my name is Molly Joan. I'm a researcher and consultant, and I've been working very closely with Cynthia and also with the TCDSB team. I've specifically been focusing on the specialized programs that are offered by the school board, or that could be offered by the school board. As Cynthia has spoken to tonight, the city landscape, the labor market, the skills that are required as we think about the future of work, they are changing and changing rapidly. And I think we are all familiar with that. But that means that we really need to be thinking about the needs and interests of students, parents, and community and how they are changing over time. And as we plan for investments in school facilities and think about capital, it's also really important that we be thinking about programming and curricula that's going to be delivered in these facilities. And not just thinking about it now, but thinking about the years ahead. So trying to anticipate what might be needed in the coming years. Really excited to be able to share tonight some of the work we've done to understand some high-level, board-wide trends when it comes to specialized programming, and to make space for questions, for feedback, for ideas and suggestions. And I know we already received a number of comments in the chat tonight, but also ahead of time when it comes to programming and interest in new types of programs for students that reflect what you all are seeing a need for in your communities and in your schools. As Cynthia mentioned right at the beginning of the meeting tonight, our goal with the program review was to identify forward-looking, future-focused opportunities for strengthening and enhancing specialized programming. And we focused on a couple of things. We wanted to focus on opportunities that reflected new and emerging technology, for example, the rise of artificial intelligence, that reflected trends in educational practice. And also, as Cynthia mentioned earlier, that would center equity and inclusivity. So who has access to specialized programming within the school board? We looked at multiple sources of data, and actually tonight's conversation is another really important input into the plan. We had regular meetings with a working group within the school board. We had focus groups and did a survey of principals from elementary and secondary schools. We did some quantitative analysis. So we did some statistical analysis of student data, and we also looked at Statistics Canada data. And then we were able to look at the evidence base, so the literature, research on emerging and promising practices in specialized programming. We also looked at what are other school boards doing? What types of programs are they offering? What are we seeing in terms of patterns or trends in the types of programs that might be offered by other school boards in the GTA and across Canada and sometimes internationally as well. One thing that I really wanted to emphasize before I dive into some of the recommendations is that we wanted to balance being informed by data and evidence and what we're seeing and hearing, but we also wanted to be grounded in particular in TCDSB's context and needs. Again, that's why tonight's conversation is so important. So we need to balance thinking ambitiously and innovatively with also being pragmatic. So with that, I'll touch on a few high-level insights, and then I'll dive into some of the more specific recommendations. So the first thing and I'm sure many of these things will come as no surprise, but the first thing that we heard throughout our conversations with principals, that we saw in the research and evidence on specialized programming, is that quality of instruction is paramount when it comes to specialized programming. That is the thing that makes the biggest difference. It is not one particular model that is, particularly impactful for students. It really comes down to teachers and staff who really champion these programs at schools. We also saw that it's really important to have what we're calling future ready facilities. So facilities that can support really high quality STEAM programming, that can support what Cynthia mentioned earlier around machine learning and construction. That takes a certain type of facility to support that type of programming. So we need to be thinking about how we're investing in the spaces that students are learning in. We also saw in analyzing TCDSB data that there were some opportunities to think about access to and enrollment in specialized programming. Currently, there are some differences in terms of who has access to specialized programs and who doesn't. I can speak a little bit more about that, but we saw some patterns in terms of who was enrolled in programming, and students who may be living in areas that are more marginalized, or let's say lower income, may not have the same level of access to specialized programming like French immersion, like extended French, like international baccalaureate programming, for example. So that's something that's really important to keep in mind. We also heard, and I'm seeing in the questions, I heard in the questions that were submitted ahead of time, that there is an interest in expanding and enhancing specialized program offerings, and really doing so in a way that lines up with community interest and demand, and what each community is looking for is going to be different across the board. So we have to be thinking both at a systems level and at a community and school specific level. Okay, so I'm going to talk through a couple different findings and then some opportunities for consideration. And again, these are all preliminary and are part of a discussion we're having tonight. So the first thing is that there is growing evidence on the importance of career-focused and sector-focused programming. And really critical here is programming that lines up with in-demand sectors in a local labor market, so in the GTA, and sectors that pay a living wage, so that students can thrive as they leave secondary, as they potentially pursue post-secondary or different pathways that are open to them as they finish high school. So with that in mind, there is an opportunity to think about the sector-focused programming that the school board, that the TCDSB currently offers. For example, specialist high skills major programming, and thinking about to what extent does that line up with the jobs that are in demand in the Greater Toronto Area. There's an opportunity to think about how we incorporate industry recognized certifications, experiential learning, work integrated learning into the programs that are offered. Really thinking about how we prepare students for work and for what comes post high school. And also, again, thinking about equitable access to to different career focused and sector focused programs across the city. There are the school board currently offers lots of different specialist high skills major programs, but certain streams, for example, an arts and culture stream or the construction stream, may be available in different parts of the city. So we need to look at where different programs are located and who has access, and is there a way to make that more equitable? The next piece in this, going back to the previous slide. In terms of STEAM programming, we are seeing lots of school boards in the GTA, but also elsewhere, making big investments in STEAM programming. And as I mentioned earlier, research on the effectiveness of STEAM programming really prioritizes the quality of instruction over any one model of delivering STEAM programming. We're also seeing in student data that female students appear to be underrepresented in STEAM programming relative to male students. So again, there's an opportunity to think about equitable access to STEAM programming. And so what we're recommending is really thinking about doing a deeper dive into STEAM programming at both an elementary and secondary level, to think about how we might strengthen the components of STEAM programming and opportunities that exist for students. On a related note, we are seeing school boards in Ontario, across Canada, and even internationally investing in what I called future ready schools. So these would be schools and facilities that support really high quality STEAM programming, career focused programming. So that could look like modular spaces for learning. It could look like science labs or robotics labs. It could look like spaces that support machine learning, as Cynthia shared earlier. It could look like spaces that mimic a work environment. And so students can get some practical experience. All that requires investment. And what we're proposing is that there's an opportunity to just explore the feasibility of investing in some state-of-the-art learning centers and really thinking about doing that in a way that's timely, that's financially sustainable, and that will be equitable. So thinking about how do we make sure that as many students as possible have access to those new facilities. And again, this is all sort of exploratory. French programming. French programming came up a lot, and we are seeing provincial boards across the province of Ontario and Canada more broadly, really thinking about how they structure their French programming. And we've heard about lots of challenges that are being experienced, particularly with recruiting qualified teachers to teach French programming, challenges with student retention and the level of support students might need in French programming, and again, with equitable access to French programming. What we're seeing with the TCDSB student data is that male students tend to be a little underrepresented in French immersion and extended French relative to female students. We also see that students who live in less marginalized areas, so more wealthier neighborhoods, are more likely to live closer to their nearest French immersion or extended French school and to be enrolled in those schools. Moving forward, there's an opportunity to really monitor retention and enrollment in French programming, to really make space to hear from principals, teachers, community around the sort of French programming and how it's being experienced, and to think about an in-depth review of potential restructuring options to make that programming as effective and strong as it possibly can be. Cynthia alluded to this earlier. We heard that there was quite a bit of interest from principals who shared that they heard this from their community around expanding access to athletic programs. So, for example, the high performance athletics program. There is a school in North York, McGuigan, a secondary school that offers an HPA program. And there's interest in whether or not we could bring an HPA program, an athletic program, to the east side of the city as well. Again, thinking from an equity standpoint. I mentioned earlier, staff quality of instruction is so fundamental here. So the LTAPP does include a recommendation around how we recruit and retain staff who have skill sets to support specialized programming. We heard from board staff, we heard from principals that this is such an important success factor and also can be quite a challenge with specialized programming. So for example, if we want to deliver career sector focused programming, we need someone who has expertise in that sector, and sometimes that can be hard to come by. We're recommending that there's some work to be done in collaboration with teachers unions, in collaboration with other stakeholders, to think about strategies for enhancing recruitment, retention, and professional development, and really thinking about the staffing needs that come with any new or changed specialized programming. So really thinking through the staffing implications. Final two recommendations. We are seeing school boards shifting from a school-specific application process for specialized programming to a more centralized application process, a more standard application process. And one of the reasons for that is because of equity concerns. It's really important here that we think about how we balance making sure students are set up to succeed in specialized programming, that they have what they need to do well in those programs, they have supports in place, while also making sure that we're having an equity lens to that, making sure that as many people as possible have access to those programs. So that's an important balance to strike. And we're recommending that the school board continue to develop a standardized, a transparent, really critically, application process first for specialized programming, and continue to use data to think about where we offer specialized programming. Again, making sure that all students, no matter where they live in the city, have access to really high quality specialized programming. And then finally, having an understanding of what's working and what's not working with specialized programming requires data. And Data can look like, okay, how many students graduated from a program? What did they do after they finished that program? Data is also feedback from community on their experiences with specialized programming. What did they like about a program? What did they not like? So one of the recommendations in the LTAPP will be to continue to strengthen data collection. The big component of community voice is having ways of community sharing feedback and information on their experiences, and really monitoring what difference does specialized programming make for students, and how do we use that information, program outcomes, for example, to strategically make decisions around what programs we invest in. I'm going to pause there and I'm going to pass it back to Cynthia.
Thank you, Molly. Okay, so just to summarize some of the highlights of the long-term accommodation plan, as I said, I mean, historically, the board has submitted capital priority requests along with other school boards in hopes of receiving funding. But that's a very slow process to be able to invest significant dollars into buildings and programs for students. So one of the key things to explore is whether the board has the ability to pivot away from their reliance on grant funding and self-fund more than $2 billion investment in both facilities and program enhancements over the next 15 years. Does the board have the potential to realize permanent increases in Toronto Catholic enrollment through partnership exploration? And that's something that we talked about. And as Molly was mentioning, looking at the ability of the board to invest in alternative means of specialized program delivery, making timely investments in tech-supported and STEAM-related learning opportunities in congregated block settings, and looking at the potential as part of that to increase the number of subject matter teaching experts, which is going to be all important as technology, which is pervasive in most every learning aspect going forward, making sure that we have subject matter teaching experts for those particular programs, improving access for students to those specialized programs, and providing co-op opportunities and related to future career initiatives at the secondary level in particular, and reducing and eliminating operating deficits, which is really important to do, and reduce potential investments and facility renewal needs over time. So going forward in terms of this engagement process, there's a range of engagement opportunities that are available to all stakeholders. There is the online Q&A forum. We will be presenting similar presentations to several focus groups, the union partners, SEAC, CPIC, and CSLIT. Over the next couple of weeks, there will be a set of 4 in-person town hall meetings on February 18th, 19th, 25th, and 26th. And of course, there is the online survey, which I would really encourage you to have a look at. And please respond with your feedback. That would be great. And then the expectation is that the final LTAPP report recommendations, incorporating all of the feedback from this engagement process, will be presented to the Board of Trustees. It's likely just to be approved in principle. The board won't be taking any specific decisions around any specific schools or any particular strategies going forward at that particular point. That will all unfold as it normally does, because much of it requires consultation with the communities going forward. So Shar, I think we'll turn it back to you. Thank you so much.
Wonderful. Thank you so much to our consultants for the presentation. So we'll get into our Q&A. I know that we have 11 minutes, so we're going to blitz through as many questions as we can. And I just want to remind everyone that this session is being recorded and will be posted online. That was one of our questions, so we've answered that one. We have a question here. How do you determine which schools will receive renewals and in which order?
Michael, do you want me to answer that question? Just raise your hand if you do.
Yeah, Cynthia, go ahead and I'll jump in.
I mean, at the end of the day, the board itself and the recommendations from the planning staff and the facility staff will be what guide the trustees in their decisions in that regard. But when we're looking at it purely from a draft LTAPP perspective, you're looking at things like the FCI, Facility Condition Index of the particular building. You're looking at the enrollment to capacity, not just today, but going out 15 years. You're looking at what programs are in that school. Where is it drawing students from? Are there a lot of students that are not within walking distance, but are coming into programs, that are outside of the walking distance? So a number of factors like that are looked at in those decisions. But as I said, the key one is zeroing in on school facilities that have a FCI that is in excess of 40%.
Wonderful, thank you. Moving on to our next question, we have, what criteria is used to determine whether a school is operationally unviable? Example, too few students enrolled.
Sure. So I think Cynthia kind of touched upon that in the answer she just gave. I mean, there's a myriad of factors. There's enrollment factors, there's facility condition factors, there's location factors, but really, I mean, those are really the big three criteria that are traditionally used to assess viabilities of schools.
Thank you. Our next question is, how soon can these recommendations get implemented?
I think I'm going to give that one to you, Michael.
So I'm going to actually, Cynthia, you really kind of started answering in your presentation. So I think Cynthia really hit the crux of the head. So what's being presented tonight is really a framework, right? It's kind of a strategy, it's a plan. Every kind of subsequent decision is subject to a different process, whether it be a board approval, whether it be a ministry approval, and as well is a key component being community consultation. So it's really kind of difficult to pinpoint a specific time frame for implementation, but do note that the plan itself is 15 years in length, so that perhaps provides some level of guideline.
And I'll just add to that, Kashar, there are a couple of questions on there again about the 15-year timeline. But in that 15-year timeline, one of the opportunities the board has had is we worked very closely with the City of Toronto when we were developing the education development charges that the board adopted in December of 2023. They shared with us all of that information that you saw on the map I shared with you, and that is all of the development applications in the City of Toronto, more than 700,000 units that were in the development pipeline. They shared with us very particular information from that, and that's all built into the enrollment projections over the 15 years. It actually gives us information about what type of units. Are they going to be condo units? Are they going to be 1 bedrooms and 2 bedrooms or a mix? Are they going to be townhouses? And we can determine out of that based on the board's own enrollment and the impact data, which is municipal property assessment data, how many students per household the Toronto Catholic District School Board would normally yield from a particular type of housing development. So all of that is built into the enrollment projections, why it's important to look out the 15 years.
Thank you. Our next question is, I'm happy to see that STEAM programming is a priority. However, how will you ensure that underserved areas have equal access to these programs? What mechanisms are or will be in place to ensure equity?
Like me to jump in and I can get started on that answer, or alternatively, Adrian, do you want to speak to that?
No, go ahead, Molly, I'll follow.
So, very good question. Like, our approach has been, we need to start by understanding sort of the current state of where programs are located. So we are able to use metrics like understanding on average, how long would it take a student living in different areas to get to their nearest program? And once we have an understanding of who has access, how far does someone need to travel to that program, we can then use that information to make strategic decisions around where a new program would be located. So, from my perspective, it's about first understanding, hey, what is the implication of offering a STEAM program here versus there? How many more people would have access or how many more students or households would have access if we put it in this area versus this area, and then using that information to make some strategic decisions. Adrian,
Yeah, I'll just add, Molly, to that as well, that like STEAM programming and STEAM philosophy is an instructional type of mindset that I think we have to differentiate between formal and informal programming, whereas STEAM as an instructional philosophy could be integrated into all of our high schools, and it is. There are other STEAM programs designated at schools that have specific criteria and courses linked to them. We're always open and eager to explore ways to expand the offerings of those programs. Remember, it's not in isolation, however, because STEAM and STEAM programming is one component of the suite of specialty programs that we offer, and that's part of the process as well for consideration.
Great. Thank you so much, Adrian.
Shar, can I just add something
yeah.
to that? Again, being the person who looks at the financial considerations of things, I think every school board would love the opportunity to have specialized programs, a whole roster of them in every single school. But the financial reality is that there are limitations on how much the board can invest in specialized programs, having specialized teaching staff, and making sure they have sustainable enrollment in those specialized programs year over year to make sure they're financially viable. Okay.
Great. Thank you. Our next question is, what are the major enrollment challenges faced by the board?
Michael, you want to
Sorry,
start
thanks,
into
Sharon.
that
I'm gonna Cynthia touched upon this in a few of the slides, so I'm just gonna have her do a quick recap.
Well, yeah. So I think what I tried to say, so there are demographic challenges, which is, we have fewer births in the city of Toronto per household. We have fewer Catholics households in the city of Toronto. We have areas in the city that have growing Catholic population and other areas where we have declining Catholic population. We actually did some analysis that looked at children in Catholic households versus non-Catholic households by trustee ward. And, Etobicoke has the highest percentage of children per household in a Catholic household versus non-Catholic households. But a lot of the other areas in the city of Toronto have very low numbers. So I think, all those demographic factors. I think, as some of the trustees pointed out, is when you don't financially have the ability to invest in all programs and have before and after school care and childcare in every school and that sort of thing, it does make it more difficult to make sure that you attract all of the students that you would like to attract to Toronto Catholic schools. And so I think, those are part of the challenges, both from a demographic and enrollment perspective. Do you want to add something, Michael?
No, I think you covered it. I think one of the I want to point out was Cynthia had a nice map showing kind of intensification, and I think one of the issues we're looking at is a disconnect between the capacity available in the areas where growth is coming.
Yep, that's true.
Great, thank you. Our next question, we got a few questions about before and after school care. A few people wondering if the plan incorporates before and after school care for elementary schools, because a lot of parents are struggling with this in the city.
Yeah, so Cheryl, I'm going to pass this to Barbara Leparati, the head of planning, who works closely with the early years team.
Hi, everyone. Yes, every year the school board does surveys of incoming students to determine the need for a before and after school program in a school community. They are run by third-party operators, and so the program has to be deemed viable before an operator will go in and offer a before and after school program.
Thank you, Barbara. Our next question is, because there are financial limitations in providing specialized programming, is sharing between geographically local schools an option?
I can jump in and just quickly say, with the recommendation around exploring at an early stage, centralized or congregated learning centers, yes, that is an option on the table to be explored. Again, very, very early days, but yes, that is something that could be considered. But there are lots of factors that need to be taken into consideration in that case.
I might be able to add, I think that there is a current regional flavor and sensitivity to some of our specialty programs in terms of the areas of the city that they draw from. Again, cognizant of the fact that it impacts enrollment at different schools, and all of our schools deserve the enrollment in terms of their most local home schools that feed in. We are looking at that from a regional perspective and how we could best serve that. It'll entail the introduction of perhaps some new programs to be geographically more accessible, but we're confident that in all the offerings that kids will find their way into these programs.
Thank you. Our next question is, are there long-term plans on increasing in-school accommodation facilities, program and support for students with special needs? Some French and regular schools do not have a designated area to support kids with needs or enough EA supports.
I'll take a shot at it. I mean, it's an ongoing point of discussion, and we've been very transparent and public about our financial restraints and deficits that we're facing at the current time. Admirably, from a spec ed perspective, we keep overspending above budgeted lines for all the right reasons. I'll say it's a noted concern. It continues to inform the way that we program for these very deserving students.
Thank you. Our next question is, will virtual schools be supported to offer increased courses, such as an example for high school tech credits, French in all grades, high-level maths, etc.? Can students count on continuing this option long-term?
Yeah, I'll take that one as well. Just really quickly, St. Anne's, not every board has maintained the remote or virtual school options. We're proud of the fact that we've maintained our virtual school option, also attracting kids from other boards in terms of serving the needs that those students are looking for. At the end of the day, St. Anne's, our remote school iteration, is enrollment driven. We ask our students to declare and their parents in terms of their interest in that modality and that option. And then if the numbers warranted that it is our intention to keep providing that as a remote option, as long as it's demand driven. Just a sensitivity in terms of the response. Student requests inform the courses that are offered at any school, at any high school, for example, and those drive staffing allocations. So at a school of the size of secondary school at St. Anne currently, we cannot provide all program or comprehensive programming strictly because of the staffing limitations. The good news is that our day e-learning and our Con Ed options provide a lot of viable other course options for students that are interested in those other courses that we can offer at St. Anne.
Thank you. Our next question is, why are there never new schools or programs being announced in Scarborough?
Yeah,
So
Michael.
I think, sorry, I'll maybe take a start, and Cynthia, you can jump in. I think in Cynthia's presentation, she quite eloquently described kind of the couple of criteria that are looked at for new schools. Typically, they're based on over enrollment or facility utilization. And the other part of it is that while the board makes cases for new schools, the current model has the board in line with every other school board in the province to get funding for those new schools. So there's limitation on process and some of those factors. Cynthia, do you want to elaborate a bit?
Yeah, that being said, though, Michael, as we do have in the EDC bylaw, the redevelopment of the Scarborough Town Center with high-rise condos is part of the city's plans. The Golden Mile. So there are a couple of areas with major transit facilities where the city intends some significant development. And there is a recognition that there is a need for the board to have a presence in those areas. And so funding those are part of the underserved areas that we've mentioned in the presentation.
Great, thank you. We're going to go into our last question now. And I just want to reiterate that any questions that are not answered today, we do have a community engagement website, which is engage.tcdsb.org. And there is a Q&A tool there where you can submit a question, but we will also load some of the questions that we received today and answer them after tonight's session. So our last question is, what is a boundary review?
I'll take a stab at that one, Shara. So every elementary school across the board has a fixed attendance boundary. So it's essentially a geographical area that delineates, where students should be attending. So a boundary review is a review of boundaries, typically between, let's say 2 to 5 schools, in order to move those boundaries to balance enrollment between the various schools there. So it changes the geographic area of attendance.
Great, thank you so much. Thank you everyone for joining us. Jonathan, if you want to go just to the next slide, I just want to remind everyone of our in-person town halls. This will be taking place after the Family Day weekend. we will be hosting 4 town halls, one for the Etobicoke region, one for the Scarborough region, one for the Central Toronto region, and one for the North York region. We invite you to come in person and to learn more about the data that is relevant to the wards, specific to the areas that we'll be talking about. And you can RSVP online on the engage.tcdsb.org website. I think there may be one more slide. This is what the website looks like just for everybody. It has all of the information that you'll need to know about the LTAPP process and recommendations, goals, and themes. And our survey is going live tonight. It's already live, actually. So if you'd like to take the information that you learned today and complete the survey, we would greatly appreciate your feedback. You can also share some of your thoughts and commentary in the survey as well. So I just want to thank everyone for their time. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. And if you have questions, please submit them in the engage.tcdsb.org website. And we look forward to hearing everyone's feedback. Thank you so much. Good night, everyone.